Dante Alighieri, one of Florence's most famous citizens, poet, author of the Divine Comedy. Dante was an important citizen of Florence even when he was alive. He was a political figure, serving on the town's council and even being one of the priors. But in 1301, he got into a political disagreement and was exiled. It is from this exile, 1301 to his death in 1321, that comes the passion for the Divine Comedy. His journey as an exile is translated into this story of a pilgrim's journey, a journey through the three realms, afterlife, hell, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Now, while the fiction of this poem is a story of this journey through the afterlife, the real intent of the poet is to tell us how to live while alive. It's an ethical poem. But in today's discussion, I'd like to point out the images that inspired Dante to create this afterworld. And these are very specific to Florence. The influence that Dante had on Florence, but also the influence that Florence had on Dante, comes through in every verse of the Divine Comedy. Now take a look at this painting by Domenico Michelino behind me. This painting makes clear the worlds that Dante created in his poem, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, and how they've become part of our collective imagination of what the afterworld looks like. But Dante's influence on our world also reaches from beyond the grave, into the realm of the living. You cannot visit an Italian town that does not, in some way, mark the importance of Dante to Italian identity. Piazza Dante, Via Dante Alighieri. They all remind us that Dante gave Italians their language. His influence spread across Europe and the whole world, as people from almost every corner of the world read Dante's poem in translation. The Baptistery of Florence, Bel San Giovanni as Dante calls it, probably the most important building in the Middle Ages in Florence for the citizens of this town, and certainly the most important building for Dante, for this is the only building from Florence that he cites not once but twice in the Divine Comedy. First in Canto 19, where he tells us a very personal story of being inside the baptistry and seeing someone drowning in the baptismal font, and he breaks the font to save that person's life. In a sense, he's trying to exculpate himself from a crime that he committed and explain to his audience why he broke the fount in the baptistry. The second time he cites this is in Paradise, in the canto where he talks about the virtue of hope. And he begins that canto by recounting his hope that someday he'll return to Florence, to this building, to receive the laurel crown. Now, of course, that never happened because Dante died in exile. But this building represented the central point for Dante in his imagination of what Florence was for him and what it could be. And in fact, this was a central point for the city of Florence because it was in this building that every citizen, including Dante, at the age of 2, after they'd survived those first 2 difficult years of youth, were baptized and made official citizens of this town. And it is also outside of this building, for Piazza Duomo at that time was not this beautiful piazza that we see now, but it was a cemetery. And so it was in this piazza that they were buried and passed on to that other world, the world after life. Now inside the baptistry are fantastic mosaics done by Coppo di Marcovaldo, an artist from Dante's time. And these images represent a whole plethora of ideas from the Middle Ages, especially the Last Judgment, which we'll look at in detail. And this must have fueled Dante's imagination when he considered what life after death looks like, because not only is hell figured there, the hell mouth scene so famous, but also the area between heaven and hell, or Purgatorio, and also paradise is represented in the baptistry. So whether these images directly influenced Dante, or whether Dante himself influenced the artist who made and remade these images over time, they give us an idea of what the Middle Ages thought of when they imagined life after death. And they also maybe give us a clue to what inspired Dante when he wrote the Divine Comedy. Here we are inside of the baptistry. These images by Coppo di Marcovaldo were certainly familiar to Dante. And in the center we have the most important image, of course, which is Christ enthroned. This is the Christ that Dante would recognize. The suffering Christ was another Christ present in the Middle Ages. But for Dante, representing Christ. Christ is Christ enthroned, the emperor, and look at him on the throne there, with the symbol of the cross behind him, a symbol that is so important to Dante and that he really emphasizes, especially in Paradiso. But the most famous images, unfortunately some of them are covered for work being done, the constant work of maintaining art from the Middle Ages, are the symbols of hell to Christ's left hand. See below Christ, the sarcophagus is opening, the demons coming to torture, to bring the sinners down to hell. Just like Canto 27, where Guido di Montefeltro recounts the story of he being torn from St. Francis's hand by demons, so too these sinners are awakened and torn from their sleep to be brought to hell. Look at hell itself, the so-called hell-mouth vision. We can't see it all, but we can see Satan there, can't we? His three mouths open, sinners in all three of them. At the bottom of Dante's hell, he figures Satan in a similar way. A winged figure, a bat-like figure, the cruelest, the ugliest of all creatures, with three sinners in his mouth. Judas Iscariot in the middle, head inside the mouth, feet forward, as Lucifer bites and claws him, tortures him. Brutus and Cassius in the two side mouths. Romans, traitors, tortured by Satan just as well. Other sinners you see are being subject to various other tortures. Dante's system of punishment in hell, we might call poetic justice. The sinners aren't only tortured randomly, they're continuing to sin in their tortures, in their punishments. They're continuing to do the same action that they did while alive. In hell, punishment is eternal because their sins are eternal. There's no hope of redemption. If they could be redeemed, if they could have learned, they would not be in hell. They would be somewhere else. As we look over to the right hand of Christ, we see those who are saved. And instead of demons taking sinners out of their coffins, we have angels waiting to accompany the spirits to heaven. Purgatorio isn't represented as Dante saw it here in this baptistry. In fact, Dante's vision of Purgatorio was quite unique. He's very influential in the way we consider Purgatorio because an image of Purgatorio wasn't common in the Middle Ages. But what we do see here is what Dante figures at the top of his Purgatorio, from Cantos 27 to 33, where the divine pageant takes place. And all the figures of the Old Testament, the virtues, faith, hope, and charity, the figures of the New Testament come out in a row, in a parade, and process forth in front of Dante's eyes. Similarly here, we see saints enthroned, sitting, formal, almost allegorical figures. This strong allegorical sense that history tells many stories is at the base of the Divine Comedy, at the base of the representations we have here in the baptistry. Look above, see the movement of the saints as they process towards Christ under the sign of the cross. This exact scene is something we'll see in Purgatorio, Canto 32. So while Purgatorio is not as strongly represented here, certainly Dante would have taken some inspiration from this image of the saints enthroned in how he figures the procession in Purgatorio. Now look all around the cupola here. Take a chance to see all of the images and notice how they're leveled, layered in 4 levels. We have 4 parallel stories: Genesis, Joseph, the father of Christ, Mary and Christ, and John the Baptist. Now, you need not focus on the specifics, but look at the structure. Look at the structure of history that this tells us. That there are 4 stories, Old Testament, New Testament stories, that follow similar patterns. In fact, you can read this cupola both side to side and up and down. Because in the Middle Ages, history was typological. Events happened before, events happened afterwards, and in the middle was one particular event, which is Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. This sense of the parallel structures of history guides Dante, particularly in Purgatorio and in Paradiso. Now, as your eyes move up towards the light, you'll see a final ring of humanoid figures. These are the angels. And here we have something that must have fueled Dante as he represented paradise in the Divine Comedy. Canto 29, he talks about the 9 orders of angels, and here we have them represented. The seraphim, the cherubim, the virtues, the thrones, and others. 9 orders of angels, God's power in the world. Here, Dante sees them represented in a way very similar to the way he will represent them in Paradiso. And finally, look up to the top of the lantern, where the light is the brightest. And perhaps you can see, distant though it is, the Garden of Paradise. For Dante, the first part of paradise are the planets. As he moves through the celestial realm, he moves through the planets. But at the top of paradise, it's a garden. And here we see the representations of the non-human figures, the plants, the restored Garden of Eden in paradise. And finally, the lantern itself, that one small but bright point of light that is the divine, the encounter with the Godhead, which culminates paradise in Canto 33. The baptistry certainly must have, in its overall structure, but also in its particulars, inspired Dante in his vision of what the afterlife looked like. Certainly other places around the Italic Peninsula inspired Dante as well. I especially think of Ravenna, where Dante spent the last years of his life and is still today buried. But Dante, a Florentine citizen, even in exile, must have always thought back to this ceiling when composing his poem. Even though he couldn't see it with his own eyes, he must have imagined it in his mind as he created the Divine Comedy.
Nel mezzo del cammin della nostra vita, writes Dante at the opening of the Inferno. Dante's detour into the wasteland of the dark forest of doubt and fear becomes ours when he tells us in the first verse that his particular crisis connects to nostra vita, our life. Dante the poet creates a character of himself as pilgrim as he moves into a world increasingly devoid of humanity. The pilgrim learns to be scornful, cruel, and at the end, apathetic to the people he meets. As Dante the pilgrim ascends Mount Purgatory, he must learn again to sympathize with those he encounters. While Dante learned to distance himself from the horrors of hell, the lesson of Purgatorio is almost the opposite. It is through sharing their grief and suffering that his humanity is restored and he can dare to ascend to paradise. And in paradise, Dante can come to know the secret truths of the universe and invite us, his readers, to share this truth. Come to Florence to see Dante, to follow in his footsteps, to see through his eyes.